Welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
So thank you for joining us this week. And Paul and I are excited to bring a kind of maybe a little different episode today. And we're going to talk about diversifying careers. And we've talked about this a few times, but, for those that listen to Paul's episode, we're coming off of visiting what's called PodFest, which was really an invigorating thing, I think, for us, and just kind of highlighted, this idea that, while we're both mental health professionals, doing some other things keep us kind of motivated and, keeps us psyched.
And, it's something that really sticks out is, I haven't been to any mental health conferences before, but you and Dan have. And, just how different you both shared. And certainly I was well out of my element. And that was exciting. And you've kind of felt like a fish out of water for a bit. But then we started swimming and then we were able to kind of get into the flow. And, I do think that a part of the PodFest that I really almost appreciate is I don't think we got everything out of it, which means that there's more to go into it. So I think having diversity allows for curiosity, and it allows for us to really, pursue something that we don't get to normally attend to, or it's outside of our typical sphere. And it's really interesting.
Yeah. And it's, I think as I was thinking about kind of preparing for today, I get asked all the time, like, why I do so many different things, and, being in mental health now over 30 years, kind of like, how do I stay like wanting to come to work? And I always say like honestly, like I'm constantly saying I'm really kind of blessed in the idea that every day I actually love to come to work. And, when thinking about it, this idea of diversity isn't like something new for me in my career. It really has been, I've had a really kind of diversified career since really year one. Like there was always not just doing therapy or not just testing, that I always had my hands in other things. And, when I look back, I think it really is why I kind of stay motivated. Like I love the fact that, I'm a therapist, I'm an evaluator, I'm a writer, I speak. I do like, when I look at kind of my podcast, I can't forget that one, right? When I kind of think about all of these things, it's really the mosaic of my career that keeps it fresh. And I'd say I could probably go another 25 years, and but I like all these things. So,
and I think it's an important thing to really recognize, for all professionals, but especially professionals in the mental health field, because there's such a need. And so there's almost this feeling of, we can view ourselves as selfish for like, but if I have time, I should be giving it and I should be using it this way. And yet that's not what we advocate for our clients to do. Yet we can kind of take that on almost in a martyr sense. And I think really kind of catching that thought process there, because I don't think it serves us well. I don't think it serves our clients well in the long term. And, this goes back into other themes that we've talked about, of prioritizing a short-term solution, but really creating that a long-term, kind of a stagnation in a way, or a long-term burnout in a way. And diversity, I think, is a key. And whether it's diversity in our career or diversifying our interests outside of the therapy office, but I think we need something outside of mental health to really keep us grounded and tethered. And more so, I would even say active things outside of mental health, like not just passively, absorbing things, but really things that we're pursuing, we're engaged in, and that really kind of give us a different scope or perspective that we don't get in our day to day.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting. Last week, I had an opportunity to present to a group of psychologists, all people who are basically in private practice, that they have an organization that is just for private practitioners. And of all the things I talk about, they were like, we want you to come and talk about the science of happiness. It's like, wow, okay, I'm going to talk to a group of psychologists about happiness. And it was such a challenge for me, because I was like, yeah, they know these things, so we got into this conversation, and the conversation was about taking, not, as you mentioned, not only just professionally, but outside, taking risks to do different things. And even if we don't love them, I've done stuff in my career that I was like, oh, this is a good idea. I'm going to try this. And I went, yeah, no, that's just not for me. But it's this idea of anticipating the expectation of trying something. And even if we didn't love that activity, the process of it is, I think, just as motivating. Now, I've been lucky. I've had things that have stuck, and that's great. But even if they don't, it's still things that kind of keeps us, like, oh, I'm going to try this. I tell everybody the podcast is a great example of that for me. Never thought I'd want to do a podcast. Loved listening to them. But it's been a game changer for me. It's made me go, wow, okay, like I like doing this. I love when we have guests. I like when you and I talk. But then it also gives me topics that then I changed my writing from writing books to going, I'm going to try to write a blog post, which is a different kind of writing. So yeah, it's interesting because it's this group of psychologists I was talking to. I said, what I have found is that my happiness, career, or even personal life is taking those risks, trying those new things, and trying something that I never thought I wanted to do. And then if I like it, it just becomes another piece, right?
Absolutely. And, as we're talking, I can't help but thinking about my financial advisor in a way, and how, they were talking about like, one of the first meetings I had is that they did a risk assessment to say, okay, how much risk am I willing to take on? And, at this point in my career, it's like, hey, like it's probably better to take more risks. Like there's time to recover, but the opportunities for growth that are there. However, also talking about diversifying where we're doing our investments at. And I think that's crucial. There's so many adages, don't keep all your eggs in one basket. We really have to think about that in terms, I love that pursuing happiness piece of let's not put all of our happiness in one basket. Let's, let it spread out. And there are going to be times when it falters or it doesn't really kind of see itself through. But I think we can also piggyback off those much later on. And in fact, what's funny is that, this upcoming weekend, I'm going to be going snowboarding with my cousin for the first time in like a decade. And I loved snowboarding about a decade ago, but it just kind of, fell off. And it's something that I'm finding myself getting excited for again. And, I don't think it's going to be something I'm going to get back in. I don't know. I'm going to go and buy a season pass, for next year. But I do think it's something I'm probably going to really thoroughly enjoy, or I'm going to figure out, okay, I'm a little past my prime for this, maybe time to hang it up and keep it up. But either way, I'm looking forward to that insight. And I think diversity is what allows that. And if it's like, I don't know about that, or, I have a lot going on. And I think it's so easy to miss out on opportunities. So making sure that we are taking risks by saying yes, making sure that, we're exploring something and not overinvesting, but don't underinvest either.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you kind of brought up the idea of comparing this to financial advice, because it really is the same, right? They talk about there's, your financial advisors say it's different having money versus having wealth. And I think that's a similar thought career wise or life wise, is that, we can have a rich career in the sense that we work hard and we affect people's lives. And there's nothing wrong with that. But that may not create this overall kind of vocational wealth for us, where we really kind of have this motivation that kind of keeps going. And so when we think of the idea of diversifying, it's such a financial term, right? Yeah. Diversifying your portfolio. I think we can do that career-wise as well, is looking at, we have a good part of our kind of career wealth in one area. But then there's these other areas that we diversify that creates that, again, that kind of compounding motivation. And, I don't think it's easy for people though. I think most people sit back and go, yeah, that makes sense. But then sitting down and going, what am I going to do? Where am I going to invest that time? So for you, Paul, I guess, how did you start diversifying? How did you kind of pick, where are you going to invest your energy to kind of bring that kind of career wealth?
And, I think it's something I really didn't actively decide, but rather it was kind of a culmination of things where I always felt like it was like, okay, I need to go to the next step. I need to go to the next step in this track. And like, again, I absolutely love therapy, and, I want to do therapy in some way, shape or form the rest of my career. But I also, there's pieces of it that don't feel as connective. And so actually, when you had approached and, brought up the podcast, that was something that I was looking at like, hey, like, if I were to just have to do like a little side thing on my own, what would that look like? And what would that be? And a podcast was something I love podcasts. And I was like, I have a fear of public speaking. So this seems like a great way of challenging myself and putting myself out there. And then, it being able to do it about a topic, of psychology, that was like, wow, why didn't I think about that? Like, why didn't I think about attaching that to the career? Because for me, it was just going to be a hobby in a way. And I think being able to capitalize on the opportunities that are presented and not just like shrinking in them. And there's a Marianne Williamson quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes. But there's a portion of it that says, you shrinking does not serve the world. And I love that. Like, how do we rise to the occasion? And so one of the when I started at Cognitive Health Solutions, I think I was probably 2 or 3 months in, and you had asked me if I wanted to do a promotional video for we have a local organization, YWCA.
I remember that, yeah.
And it was Walk a Mile in Her Shoes, and we were a sponsor, and they're like, oh, would you want to do this? And I was like, that sounds terrifying. Yes. Right. And it went awfully. Like the guy, when I was there, I went to the event later on, and he's like, hey, and I was like, hey, he's like, a lot of edits. I was like, so it didn't go well. And, right. And my social anxiety, I did not like that, but it was also something, it felt like it was a challenge. It's like, okay, like, how do I improve this? And then we got into the podcast, and since then, I've done a couple different other speaking engagements, and, I do find myself public speaking in front of a crowd. Man, do I get the worst dry mouth? And okay, there's different elements here. Why is it comfortable in front of a camera? Even if we're doing a panel, or if we're doing, some guests, and I'm like, wow, I heard about these individuals, in grad school. Why here? And so that's now, when I have an opportunity, I want to develop that awareness of why in front of a crowd does it feel different than in front of an audience, like in front of the camera when I'm talking to other individuals. And that curiosity, I think, is what drives me.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, it's exposure, right?
Yeah.
I mean, bringing it back to therapy, it's putting ourselves out there. And I mean, I think I may have even said this on the show before, is that I've been used to speaking in front of a lot of people. I mean, throughout my career, that's just kind of evolved and has been wonderful. I mean, it's got to meet so many great people and so many good things that came out of it. But when we did the podcast, I was so nervous talking on a microphone. It was just like, oh my gosh, and I knew we could edit. That's the part where I'm like, we have that ability. But then all of a sudden, I don't know, that was difficult for me, but it was such a great challenge. And then, again, how these things build momentum. So for me, that changed into me doing now more media stuff where, I might get interviewed on the news because I'm more comfortable with it, or I might join a radio show, or might be a guest on somebody else's podcast. And I would never have done that several years back because for some reason that seemed daunting. And then now I love it. This week I had a chance to be a guest on a podcast that's called The Rational Egoist. Very interesting, wonderful guy. And we were talking about motivation and passion. I had so much fun. I mean, it was just such a great experience, and not a topic that I talk a lot about, but it was actually something that came from an article that I wrote for Psychology Today. And so these things just kind of link together, but I love those experiences now. And so, that day I was recording an hour between appointments that I had, but man, I was on a high. And even the person that I saw afterward was like, hey, you look like you're on in this great mood. And I said, well, yeah, I was on this podcast with this guy who was just great to chat with. Like it was a nice, really nice interview. And I'm like, yeah, so I'm kind of on that high, kind of coming off of it. So it impacts us. And then that's contagious for people I see, so I mean, it's like this idea of how it kind of helps us in our everyday career. That's a good example for me. And it was like, I would have never thought that, but I probably was like that the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Which I think's, fun. So, for me, it was a little different. Like I didn't know early in my career what I wanted to do. And it was, and this goes back to another episode, in the past. For me, it was thank goodness for mentors. I mean, it was really somebody who just said, hey, I want you to do this. And I never forget the first little mini article that I wrote was not great, but it was something that somebody kind of just said, hey, you should do this. It might be something good to kind of promote your career. And then that started, and then it just, it evolves from there.
And from that, and also I think something I took away from PodFest is, Bob Friedberg, don't let perfect get in the way of good. And, when we're being asked to do something, and I think especially as, clinicians, we want to make sure that we're putting out something that's quality and something that's really going to resonate, because we want to foster that connection in therapy. Yet I know my first therapy session, I was not, it took experience. It took time to develop those skills. And I think the idea of stepping into that vulnerable position of not being, an expert in a way, really, it feels daunting. And I want to encourage you to take risks in that way. And I want the vulnerability to not be an expert, but to be a novice, or to be, just decent, not great, and refining a skill. And I think that that's something that, the individuals at PodFest really did well, because there was, these branching, from individuals who haven't even started a podcast to, there was a couple individuals where it's like they're posting, their financial gains month to month. And like, wow, they have a very, very, very successul career that they built.
Yes. Millions of listeners.
And being able to just recognize that scope of like, okay, where does it start off at? And, we encourage individuals all the time, hey, take the risk, be able to put yourself out there. But I think the vulnerability almost feels like it's going to take away some of our authority. And I think it just adds to it, truly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people, I would say people really need to think outside the box when we think about diversity. And I think, a lot of times when I work with kind of early career mental health professionals, there's the obvious and stuff that I've done, maybe write an article, maybe present at a conference. But, what I like to do is talk to people about like, what else is out there? So what about just being somebody that listens at a nursing home and you sit and play chess with somebody? Like, that's a diversifying opportunity. And, maybe you work with kids all day and you go and do that, and you're not a therapist, you're not doing, but it's a part that you can add, that you can use your skills that could be fun. Or maybe it's that you sit on a board of directors for a nonprofit organization, which has always been, I've done many of those, and always such a rewarding part of our career. Doing what you said, like, do a little public announcement for something like a Walk a Mile in Their Shoes for the YWCA, like that. Those are all little things that I think can help. And so they don't have to be big. In fact, some of the most rewarding ones for me are those simple things. I had a police officer that I evaluated this week for needed a clearance thing. So it's just a simple kind of evaluation that's kind of standard protocol. But we were talking, and it was interesting, and what made me think of him is how he diversifies his role as a police officer. And so he was, works pretty, significant shifts. Like they do so many days on, so many days off, pretty long hours. But he knows when his days are off are going to be like a year in advance. Like it's a pretty set schedule. So he said, yeah, you know what I do? I'm a security guard at rock concerts. And I went, oh, that's kind of cool. He goes, yeah, like I've seen everybody. Like he's like, I have front row seats to, you name them, I've seen them. And I was like, well, isn't that kind of like just being a police officer? He's like, no, it's nothing like. He's like, it's a whole it's a whole different kind of role, but it's the same skill set. If I need to protect somebody, I can. But he's like, now I'm enjoying music. I'm connecting that to. I like being a security person. I like to be a police officer, and listening to him. I mean, he was so motivated in his whole career, and it was doing these little things. And then he talked about, sometimes I volunteer and teach self-defense at schools. Like that's another thing he does.
Yeah.
And he had this just wonderful kind of diversified career for a job that I think is very hard. You're somebody who has a really tough job, but he's found these other ways to kind of tie things, and it keeps him passionate.
And I think that's such an important piece. And maybe one of the bigger takeaways is like making sure it connects with you as an individual. And so whether that's connecting in terms of the skill set, if it's connecting in terms of values and morals, don't go out there and just do something for the sake of doing it. Like find something that connects you and grounds you to it. And, it might be wildly out there, but find the tether. And, I'm now reminded of, our episode with Ro, and you were talking about how connection is the through thread in terms of the model that you and her were working on, and being able to really recognizing like, okay, hey, security guard to police officer, perception wise, that doesn't feel like too drastically different, but the experience I'm sure is. And, in terms of, what we're doing here, we're working to promote, positive insight. We're working to try to, develop, helping individuals developing skills. It sounds a lot like therapy in a way, but we're adapting it to a different medium and finding a way to make it connective and, valuable for us, hopefully valuable for you. And, really, again, diversifying our careers as we're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I like the idea of looking at that kind of through thread. I think that's a great way to kind of think it through. And just, as we kind of mentioned, I think this idea of just, encouraging people to take risks. I mean, I do think, it does relate back to that idea of happiness. And, and I always say, like, I don't know if happiness is one of those words. It's really so hard to define, but, like in a career, like it's, there's a contentment, or it creates a passion, or it does whatever that kind of positive feeling is. And I think as we find it, and not to be, discouraged, I think those listening, I think is this idea of it's okay that if you do it, you go, yeah, that's not for me. Yeah. I think, and I don't think people should be discouraged by that. I think you just find something else. What's the next through thread for you? Yeah. And eventually I think we find it. And, again, it for me, it almost is relaxing for me.
And I want to piggyback off of that discouraged piece, because I think it can also be something that, maybe it's just not the right time, or we don't have quite the right resources. And, if you may have noticed, we're trying to create a bigger social media presence. And when we were starting the podcast, social media, like it was something I was like, okay, like, hey, I really think this is going to be interesting and engaging. And it's going to be something like, I can kind of pour some creativity into that. And our social media has kind of been lackluster. And a part of that is, expanding. And I was like, it's a lot more challenging. It's a lot more than I thought. But now, again, so grateful for PodFest, because they gave some different tools and resources and ways to expand on content in a way I didn't really ever consider. And so now being able to take another approach, and I'm really excited. And, it's funny, actually, I talk about diversifying. I was asking my wife 2 days ago, I was like, am I being annoying talking about the podcast stuff yet? Because like, it's just been nonstop since we've been back. And I'm like, oh, what about this idea? What about this idea? And she's like, no more annoying than I'm sure it is for you. And like, she's been really kind of interested, diversifying for herself, not her career, but, an interest in terms of like, I'm exploring new skincare, and she's trying to find, different dupes for expensive products. And like, she just really enjoys sharing that. Yeah. And, I don't use the skincare products, but I'm really excited. Like I get excited for her when she's able to find something and engage in it. So we're also able to build one another up. And so she's able to provide feedback and sharing that, that engagement. I'm providing feedback and sharing that engagement. So not only in our careers, but I think also in relationships and friendships, just personally, again, like so many different applications here.
Yeah. It's, I love the idea that you're you're really talking about the contagion of it, right? It's this no matter what it is. And I experienced that with my wife, but also with my friends. I mean, it's interesting. I do the same thing. Like, I feel like I talk about certain things so much. But there's many times that they'll be like, oh no, like it's really motivating for me. Like, I think of something else to do. So yeah, that contagion piece is I think so interesting. I think it's why, conferences are so important professionally. Like, we've talked about PodFest, but whether it's, going to a psychology conference or a counseling conference, it has the same kind of value to it. And, for me, that's always been a launching point for ideas, similar to what we did at PodFest. It, where I sit with people and that connection and relationship with them, and they go, oh, next year we should do a presentation on this. And it's like, oh, wow, I never thought about that. Or, maybe we should, do a proposal for a different conference, or maybe we should write something, or whatever it might be. It does. It just kind of has this growth. And I think the more you tell people about it, the more you become passionate about it. Kind of like the old theory with, if you're on a diet, you should tell everybody that you're on a diet because it holds you more accountable to do stuff. I think that happens with this kind of stuff as well. If I'm writing something, I tell people about it. Not really because I want people to know. I almost need that to kind of continue my motivation in it. So I think the contagion's great. I think that's a great thing to think through.
And I almost treat it like a bit like a flywheel, and like, it's really weighted on one side, but if we can just push it a little bit, the momentum can really carry us around to the next revolution. And we need effort to bring it right back over and push it over again. But a lot of the momentum is there from the sharing, from the, being able to talk about, and like, some of the accountability pieces of it. And all of that, I think, helps with follow through and exploration for us. So again, diversity in many different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think at times when we're feeling bogged down, that's important. And I think there's a lot of careers that are difficult. So the more we add that flair to it and give something else, it lets us get through those difficult moments. So, no matter what we do, we're talking, I guess, mostly mental health, but I think no matter what we do, there's ways that we can expand our ideas.
And I think, I keep getting hung up on the happiness thing. I want to come back to that for a moment, and maybe pairing that with the idea of fulfillment. And if we're looking for fulfillment, in our career, but also I think in our life, like, we need these different outlets. And so I think there needs to be a practical outlet. I think there needs to be a creative outlet. There needs to be, an outlet where we do feel a sense of mastery and a sense of like really deep, like it connects with our values and morals. I think we need, entertainment outlets, in different ways. And so being able to find those different connections, and, it reminds me, and I think I had shared with you and Dan when we were down at PodFest about how, the week or two prior, I was, my sister-in-law asked me if I wouldn't mind putting together, just throwing together a murder mystery idea and doing all, and like, I agreed to it months in advance. And I procrastinated until like, it was like, a month out. And I was like, okay, wow. Yeah, no, I just agreed to like, bring these individuals through an adventure. And I had no idea what I was doing. And I started, and it was trial, error. And then I was like, oh, I really like that. And then the ideas grew and grew until, at the very end, like, it was like everyone absolutely loved it. They're like, Paul, when are you doing the next one? I'm like, it's gonna be a little while, but it's just the idea of like, that's something that, she just threw my hat in the ring, and I said yes. And so, I don't think we should be saying yes to everything, albeit Jim Carrey's yes man, but we should be saying yes to some things, and especially the things that we kind of surprise ourselves with.
Yeah. And I think that idea of, you're talking about the different kind of areas, creativity or whatever they may be. They can be different for everyone. And, I guess I would encourage you to basically, if you're listening, take a moment and just start writing down some ideas of areas you want to go in. Maybe you're not a creative person, but there's other options. Maybe, I know people who love research, and that's a whole different piece. Yeah. But maybe start there, because I think if we think about those categories, then it's easier to then go, okay, what could I do in a creative realm? Like what might that look like? And then you can just start thinking outside the box. And then once you have that list, and you just go. For me, I keep a list on my phone. And every time I have an idea, no matter how outlandish it is, I just type it on there. And I probably have words that are listed. But then I go back and I go, yeah, I want to try this. And, most of mine probably have a professional flavor to it, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's something off the wall. So, starting with just kind of knowing what are the areas we want to go into. Is it volunteerism? Is it advocacy? Is it wanting to be on a board? Do we want to do something around business? I mean, it's endless where we can go. But start there.
And I do really also want to challenge yourself and approach it with the belief that you're more capable than you think you are. Because I think, we rise to meet the occasion, and sometimes we don't, but I think far more often we do, and we surprise ourselves. And so give yourself that opportunity, to celebrate and to feel that sense of accomplishment, because that's what we're talking about, that diversity piece that really feels invigorating. Mm-hmm. It's, wow, that was really cool. Or wow, that turned out way better. Like, right. Give yourself some of those wow moments.
And I think those wow moments paired with even the idea, again, they're not all going to go that well, but to pause and go, okay, but I like doing it. When I read my first article that I ever wrote, I don't talk about it very often, nor do I like to read it. I still have it, actually. I still have a copy. It was really bad. It was, and when I kind of knew it when it came out. I was like, okay, this wasn't the best thing I ever did, but it made me want to do it better, because I enjoyed the process of it. And I think the same with presenting. Gosh, I've had some rough ones, but it also, I like doing it, and it made me go, okay, I want to be better at this. So I want to practice. So have those wows, but also, when it's not exactly wow, it's okay to go, how do I take this different? What's the next step? You
want a good example of that? Go back to one of our first few episodes that are far too over edited in my editing. And that's, I go back and I listen to them, and I cringe a little bit, but I appreciate the process of where it brought us now. And I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah, I agree. So it's that mix, wows and also some growth areas that we focus on.
Yeah. And, I think, if anything, it's so important that, look for the domains, look for those different areas that you can explore, push yourself, take the risks that you don't think you're capable of. And, there are going to be some times when it doesn't turn out well, but then also when it does, make sure you celebrate the wows and really give yourself that sense of accomplishment. And I think if you're able to do that, then, you're diversifying well.
Yeah. And those of you listening, I honestly, Paul mentioned about we're kind of expanding our social media. I'd love to hear the wows. I would love to hear what you are doing in your careers to diversify, and share with us on, Facebook or other social media. Your stories will motivate others. So we'd love to hear what all is going on in your roles.
Thank you for the social media post, Ray. That's an easy one now. We hope you enjoy this episode. Check back in 2 weeks. But until then, be well and stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.